So if we could just stand here just for a second. So it's not too close. It's not too close. We could stand like this. Okay, so now let's see what that looks like. Okay, we are back with a different background. See how this works. Yeah?
Yep, I think it looks good, yeah.
I think so. I think so, and maybe it makes us look smarter with all of these books. But what we want to discuss in this podcast is Romans, and so no matter what our background is, we're going to be having some good stuff here. And what we want to do is a little bit like what we did with the Book of Job, kind of do a director's cut. So as a priest and as a part-time preacher. So we're just going to walk through Romans and talk about it a little bit, and then just see where we come out. And you are an expert.
No.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Compared to me, you're an expert on Romans. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, because I've been preaching on it, I've done some thinking about it, yeah.
So let's just start with an overview of Romans. And I think we have some slightly different ideas about this. I think we would both agree that Romans is really important of the Pauline epistles. Really important for Christians today to understand. How would you start? How do we look at Romans, in your opinion?
Yeah, of course, when you come to any book of the Bible, you want to, of course, first begin by thinking what is the occasion of the letter,
right?
Why is the author writing this letter, and to who is the author writing this letter to? So those are important things. So of course, the New Testament is written to us in a sense. I think we've had this conversation before,
right?
But it is written to us through somebody else.
Right.
So if it is,
I think we were talking about Philippians or something. You said
yes.
It's written to the Philippians
first, yes.
First, and so there are things that are just purely for the Philippians at that time. That like I think Paul says, I don't know. I every time I think of you, I thank God for
yes,
you.
Yes, indeed.
Kind of and
indeed.
does that mean that we need to do that all the time as Christians today? It's nice, but we don't. It's not an injunction for Christians today. It's just him writing to the Philippians.
Of course, what you want to be careful with is to make a long distance between them and us.
Right.
So yes, it's clearly written. The author is writing to them, then to us. But you don't want to make them and us like two separate. We are both in the New Testament. We are both are sinners saved by grace. So we are like them in ways that I think we do not think about as we should.
Well, I think this is one of the weaknesses of people saying, yes, well, that was then.
Yes, that was then, and now, indeed.
They have exactly the same problems.
Exactly, they were just like us in many ways, So yes, think about them, think about the occasion then, think about, some of the historical then, but, and it's helpful for us to understand it, but then yes, don't think you're too different from them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Good principle. So that's where we start, and then this is being written to whom?
Yes, so it's written to the church in Rome by Paul, and the church in Rome. We do not know very much about how it began, so it's not. There's even no tradition about an apostle beginning this church or starting this church. I think the best guess is probably after Pentecost. There were people there. There were Jews there, and who lived in Rome, and they went back with the gospel, and the church grew. The church started in Rome. So I think that's probably the best guess. Paul has not been there before. To Rome. He's looking forward to it. Of course, he knows many people in the church in Rome. So in the chapter 16, there's a long list of people there. So Paul is familiar with this church, but he's never been to this church. It does seem like a really good church. We'll probably come back to that later. Again, as you can imagine, Rome is a big city. lots of things going on. And Paul, as he writes this, is at a pivotal time in his ministry, season in his ministry. So as you know, 10 years before, he was sent out from Antioch to go and do missionary work among the Gentiles. And that's what he's been doing for the last 10 years. So you probably know of the famous missionary journeys of Paul, the first missionary journey, the second missionary journey, the third missionary journey. And as he writes this letter, he's at the last bit of the third missionary journey. So he's almost finishing his last journey. And he's heading back to Jerusalem, as it were, to hand over. As it were. He's finished the work in the Eastern Mediterranean and is ready to move on to a new project, to a new phase of his career, as it were.
Well, when do you think this was written?
I'm not sure about the dates. I think we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
So I think it's much later on. Like I've said, it's at the end of the third missionary journey. So Acts 20, I think that's where he is. So he's been he's in Corinth. Yeah. And there have been lots of problems in Corinth, and that's what has delayed him. So in Romans chapter 1, he says, I long to see you, I've been longing to come to you, but I've been prevented. And I think he has been prevented because of all the trouble that has been going on in the Corinthian church. And there's no way Paul is going to finish his ministry in the Eastern Mediterranean before he sorts out the Corinthian church. He doesn't want to leave that unresolved. And it does look like right now that is resolved. He's in Corinth. In 2 Corinthians 8, he's told them to collect money. You know, that would be the sign that something good is going on in that church. And now he's in Corinth. He's probably taking that money and heading to Jerusalem to take all the money, the fruit of his ministry. And there's a representative from all the churches, you know, that he's been ministering, and they're all going to Jerusalem with all the money from all these churches. Yeah. And I think it's a sign of, see what the Lord has done. You sent me out 10 years ago, and this is the fruit of what has been going on. Yeah. And then, of course, then the next phase is what he's looking forward to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, we've talked about this before. I did a study on Romans that made me cross-eyed. That's why I have to wear these. No, I'm just kidding. But I went through every single pronoun.
Yes.
And that takes a lot. And was, circling every pronoun and saying, who is that? When he says we, who is that? Who says us, who is that? And it for me, with the exception of a few sort of, let's say 5 to 9, somewhere in there, you start to get what I was considering to be a lot of Gentile stuff. But I would say that 2/3 of it, the majority of Romans, is to Pentecostal Jews. These Jews that had accepted Christ and maybe fled to Rome because they were being persecuted by, Paul. And so they fled, because he does talk about, being baptized has, you're baptized into his death, and death was a real possibility for these people. So when you got baptized then, I mean, today we talk a little bit about persecution, but when you got baptized then, you really had, a mark on your head, as it were. And so it seems to me that this is mostly to Pentecostal Jews who are still looking for a kingdom.
I'm not sure. So, of course, yeah, we do not know much about this church. We know a bit of the historical background that, yeah, of course, this church was started by the Jews. Mm-hmm. Gentiles must have joined them. Yeah. Then at some point, a persecution arose in Rome, and the Jews fled. Yeah. But now they are back. So there's a bit of that going on, but it's a mixed church of both Jews and Gentiles. Yes, the pronouns is an interesting thing in Romans, and especially the use of you. Who is this you, that he keeps talking about? So chapter 2, you therefore, and who is this you and who is we? I think, and people disagree on this. As he mainly talks about this you when he's talking about the Jews. So that's why it might feel like it's mainly addressing the Jews.
Yes.
However, the you is usually in the singular, so you've done the pronoun. So anytime he says you, one person. And then you have to ask yourself, out of a church of maybe 200 people, is Paul dedicating all this time just addressing one single person in that congregation?
No.
My guess is that, and I could be wrong, that this is a hypothetical you.
Yeah.
So throughout Paul's ministry, the last 10 years, the biggest challenge he has faced is the Jew who says, you are wrong, Paul, you are selling us out, you are a traitor.
Yeah.
He's had this Jewish objection. And as he writes this, he has this sort of Jewish objection in his mind. Of course, this is also comes to why is Paul writing this letter? Because that's really important. Is he writing this letter to address some problem in the book or in the church in Rome? Or why is he writing this letter? And I actually think Paul is not writing this letter because there's a problem in the church in Rome. He says very nice things at the end of Romans in chapter 15. And this is the thing with Romans. So you start Romans like every other book, and you begin to figure out what must be the problem, in this church. And then at the end, he says this, I myself, chapter 15, verse 14, am convinced, my brothers, that you yourselves are full of goodness, complete in knowledge, and competent to instruct one another. I have written to you quite boldly on some points, as if to remind you of them again, because of the grace God gave me to be a minister of Christ Jesus to the Gentiles. So this is a solid church, ESV says, I am satisfied about you. Of course, he says this immediately after talking about all the unity stuff and, all the strong and weak and all that. Then he says, actually, I myself am convinced that you are all right, you are okay. So I don't think the reason Paul writes this letter is because he wants to address some problem in the church in Rome. He's writing this letter because he's at a pivotal time in his ministry and he wants to move on to his next project. And the last 10 years, his sending church has been the church in Antioch. They have supported him, they gave him money, they sent people to visit him. And he's moving west to Spain, and Antioch will just be too far for that. He's looking for a new sending church. And the church in Rome is going to be the most strategic church to be his sending church. So again, just soon after that, he explicitly tells them, what I want to do is that I'm coming to you by way of visit, but I'm only passing by because I want you to send me off to Rome. So why is Paul writing this letter? I think he's writing this letter as a defense of his ministry. Why does he need to do the ministry among the Gentiles? And if he's defending why he needs to do ministry among the Gentiles, then of course he needs to wrestle with the Jewish objection. And so the you is the Jewish objection, the Jewish voice, or the Jew voice that keeps saying, Paul, you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be giving children's bread to the pigs, to the dogs, to the pig-eating, people. And Paul is saying, no, I actually need to do this. And he's defending his ministry to the Gentiles in that way. So the you is not really a Jew per se, is a hypothetical Jew. It's the Jewish objection that whatever he'll say will raise.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I have to go back and look. I was just trying to look at that while you were talking about the use. I mean, I'm only finding the plural one here, but it's a study worth doing.
It is. Yeah, pronouns are really significant. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
How do you know where you are?
Yeah.
I think Romans, if this sounds right, was written about 58, somewhere in there. Because I think that leaves time for, his really late works, his prison epistles. So, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, these written very, very late, moving up into, when was Paul killed? 67, 68, something like this. We don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know. It's all circumstantial evidence and trying. Just like you said in Corinthians, he's collecting the money, so this is an indication
Yeah,
that,
yeah. And of course, it's wrapping up. So one of the things people have always wrestled with the Romans is, why is it so comprehensive? Is Paul writing sort of a systematic theology? He's finishing his ministry and he's sort of trying to pull everything together. And the themes here, for example, are fairly similar to Galatians, for example, which is a much earlier letter. Yeah. And I think if we think of it as he's defending his ministry, that's why he's trying to be comprehensive, pull everything together, and tell to this church in Rome, this is what I am about, and this is what I want you to come behind, as I do. Yeah.
You know me. Is this I make a very clear distinction between the gospel of the kingdom and the gospel of grace. And so this seems to be very kingdom focused, because if you look in Romans 1:1, he's talking about that he's separated unto the I don't have the NIV here, but Paul, the servant of Jesus Christ, a called apostle, having been separated to the good news of God, which he announced before through his prophets and holy writings. So as soon as I see prophets and holy writings, things since the world began, I'm thinking kingdom, all this prophecy, all this stuff about Messiah coming, all of that. There's a mystery here. This mystery that the Gentiles will be brought in. But what I do see here is a lot of kingdom. I see a lot of well, the table's almost not big enough because I don't want you to come across the table at me, but a lot of law in here, and I don't see, I don't really see yet the one body. I don't see the gospel of grace yet. I mean, of course, it's grace is in here, but I mean, you can find grace throughout the Bible. But that doesn't mean it's the gospel of grace that we have today. I think that separation needs to be made. Is this mostly a kingdom gospel epistle?
Yeah, of course. Like we've had this conversation before, I do not make that distinction, and it does seem like Paul does not make that distinction. So when you talk about the gospel, and gospel is a big word. If you ask me, like if you summarize just the letter of Romans with just one word, I think gospel is a good word to summarize Romans. But how do you define gospel? So that's something, again, that a lot of books have been written on.
But isn't this one of the defining problems in all the church, that you ask a Baptist, a Kenyan, Anglican, a Pentecostal Ugandan, I don't know, some kind of, so anybody you ask and say, what's the gospel? You're going to get everything from repent and be baptized, which is John the Baptist, which doesn't have Christ in it, but people will say, repent and be baptized, that's enough. All the way to you are saved by grace through faith and not of yourselves, this kind of thing. And there's a difference in those. I mean, you get some of this lordship salvation where it says, yes, you're saved by grace, but you got to follow the rules afterwards, and you got to follow the law afterwards, because if you don't, well, you can lose your salvation. And then there's sort of this easy believism that says, you just believe.
Yeah, chips rest. Yeah,
you're good. And so, so what is it? Are there rules I need to follow?
Yeah. So Romans is a good letter for that.
Yeah.
But. Yes, I just wanted to say, like, so for example, the word gospel. So I think that's what Paul begins with in these letters. And this is called to be an apostle set apart for the gospel, and then he sort of defines the gospel, and like you said, it goes to the Old Testament to define the gospel. It says this gospel was promised beforehand through the prophets and the Holy Scriptures. And it's about his son. So the gospel is about Jesus, who as to his human nature was a descendant of David. So again, he's going back to the Old Testament to define the gospel and who Jesus was. And who through the Spirit of holiness was declared with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead. So if you ask Paul, what is the gospel? I think you'd say the gospel is the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the promised Messiah in the Old Testament. That's what he's saying. You know, Jesus has come to reign. The King has come to reign. That is the gospel. Yeah. So I think Paul does not make the fine distinction they make between kingdom and grace. Yeah. Because gospel for him is the kingdom of grace has come.
Yeah, and I think that's
it's a different kingdom, of course, from the other kingdom. So it's a kingdom of grace.
Well, I think this is why we can be in the same church and because we're praying to the same God. We're looking to the same moment.
Yes.
It's the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. How you parse that out about what dispensation we're in right now, as long as you keep your eyes on Christ, and as long as you're believing in who He is and what He did, then I think you're in good shape.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. So keep the maintain the mental.
What is salvation? I think probably people are a little more clear on what is salvation. I think maybe what is the good news, and then we talked earlier about what is your calling, and then I think once you start getting here, and it depends on how finely you want to slice it. So if you say, well, our calling is Romans to Philemon, well, that's one. So you're going to have a lot of things in there in that calling. Than if you sort of parse it out more finely. But I think that's where all Christians can kind of meet is maybe not at the cross, but maybe at the grave. Yeah, it's the ascended, risen Christ.
Yeah, indeed.
Or the risen Christ.
Indeed.
Who is at the core of where we're going. Indeed. Okay, so he's writing to these people. The Jews have probably started this church in Rome. Then they were kicked out. They're back. It's a mixture of Jews and Gentiles. It's an interesting time. The only Bible they have is the Old Testament. They have the Tanakh. Yeah. And so, and Jesus was teaching his apostles. I mean, he had a 40-day Bible study. How great would it be? And so, he wasn't using Philippians. He was using, the Old Testament. So they've got that, and now they're getting this. Yeah. So where do we go from there in understanding Romans?
Yeah. So again, it's a very systematic treatment. So that's why some people think this is our systematic theology, because again, unlike other letters, it's not like he's addressing one topic after another. You wrote to me about this, then he addresses it, you wrote to me. This is just one sustained argument. So of course he begins chapter 1, introduces himself, the first 8 sort of, I think, 13 verses or maybe 15 verses, depends how you read it. Then he introduces his big idea, his sort of thesis statement, which is probably better to start from verse 14. So I am obligated both to Greeks and non-Greeks. He has this obligation to preach the gospel to all these forms of Greeks. Why is he under obligation to preach the gospel? Because verse 16, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then to the Gentiles. For in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. So I think that's the big idea of Romans. And then he's going to tease it out. And the idea is the gospel is the power of God to salvation. And then this righteousness by faith in the gospel, the righteousness of God has been revealed. And it is from faith to faith. So it is by grace alone, as it were. That's what is saying, from faith, from first to last. Not by words, by faith. So that's sort of his big idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing that makes me think this is more kingdom, this is more Jewish, is in verse 16 where he says, to the Jew first and then to the Greek. And so that distinction is still there.
Yeah, indeed.
In this writing, whereas but I think it's in Galatians, which I think is one of the much earlier works, and he says there's no Jew, there's no Greek. I think it's Galatians 3, isn't that something? Does that ring a bell? So,
3:28, yeah.
so that to me, that starts to separate it out. Yes, salvation is here, but it starts to give it a more Jewish feel.
Yeah, and of course, Paul's big contention is this is one story. For Paul, this is one story, So it starts with the Jew and then the Gentile. And the Gentile, as it were, in the language of Romans 10 or 11, are grafted in, They've been brought into sort of this tree that already had the Jew. But yes, with a hypothetical you, Paul really has this Jew in mind. So it's going to be this Jew and Gentile thing that comes up. And I don't think it is because there's a tension between them. It's like a big tension. Of course, there probably is some tension that is normal. But I think it's just the fact that throughout his ministry, his big challenge has been this Jew objector. Indeed, soon after he writes this letter in Corinth, the Jews are going to try to kill him. And it's going to flee. And basically all they're saying is, you are a traitor, Paul. You're taking the gospel, what belongs to us, what our fathers almost, laid their lives on, and died for, and you're tossing it to, these Gentiles. So this is a big thing in Paul's ministry, and he wants to address it.
I mean, for Paul to actually have stayed the course, he had to have had the road to Damascus thing, I mean, if you hadn't seen the risen Christ in front of you saying, you go do this. I mean, this is not something you just make up in your head and then say, oh, I have this suicidal idea. I think I'll go all over the world and try to implement it.
Then after that, of course, he begins wonderfully, I think, by telling us how all human beings are fallen. So it begins by the Gentiles and some of the classic Gentile sins, so idolatry and sexual immorality in chapter 1, verse 18 to 32. But then it comes to the Jews. Jews too are fallen. They also need grace. So chapter 2 is about the religious people who, as much as they judge the Gentiles, they do the very same things, And then chapter 3 is about everybody, summarizing that, Gentiles, Jew, all of us are fallen short of the glory of God. All of us need grace. Yes. And then chapter 3, verse 21, it says, actually, that grace is now available to everyone, whether you are Jew or Gentile. So wonderful, wonderful, wonderful passage.
Yes, yes. And I did a talk on Romans 9 for this lady who had deconstructed, and I think she misunderstood Romans 9, and what she got off on the sort of Reformed Calvinist kind of track, and I just want to say one little thing here that I really like is 3:28, and I'm reading out of the literal standard version anyway. The 10th literal version, or I don't know anyway, but it says, therefore we reckon a man to be declared righteous by faith apart from works. And I think this kind of sticks the fork in this sort of Reformed idea of that faith is a work. They say, well, you're not, you can't be saved by your works, and we agree on that. And you say, yes, you're saved by faith. No, but that's a work because you have to do it. And this says, no, you are saved by faith apart from work. So faith is clearly not a work.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
And I really like that little verse there.
It's a radical idea, saved by faith alone, not by what. You don't need to do anything, not by what. And one of the things I said while I was preaching it is, because this is something that we agree on, we people disagree on it, because it sounds very Calvinistic, faith, faith alone, no works, you can do. And the question is, does this mean we can just do whatever we like because, we are saved by faith alone? You can just live the way you want if you're saved by faith alone? And I think Paul comes to address that exact question, which means this is what he's talking about. So chapter 6, he begins to address the objections. What does this mean if you're saved by faith alone? I mean, the Jews knew they needed works, but Paul says by faith alone. What then shall we say? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? That's an obvious objection if you say we are saved by faith alone, Yeah, and it addresses that and basically says,
I think an important thing here is looking at it from God's view and looking at it from man's view. If I look at some people who say they're Christians, I would say, I don't think they're a Christian. I don't think they're saved. But thank God I'm not the one who decides that. And so, it's God who decides. And like he says in chapter 14, who are you to judge my service? So, so from a God point of view, you have to say, look, if the person says, I'm a believer in Jesus Christ, death, burial, and resurrection, and by faith, who are you? Who are we to say otherwise? That's God decides. Paul does say, okay, yeah, but from a human point of view, if you are misbehaving, if you are, I don't know, in any of the many of Paul's sins that he talks about, if you're doing those things, we will invite you to leave. And then, when you've gotten yourself rearranged, you can come back into communion with the church. So there, on one way, we can't decide. God decides. On the other hand, if we don't see that change, there can be a sanction.
Yeah, that's really helpful, isn't it? So we can't decide people's eternal destiny. We can't judge on that, And yet at the same time, I think there's an expectation that we'll see transformation, isn't it? And we hope there'll be transformation, and if there's no transformation, then
Well, there should be transformation, but how much transformation? And then, I've seen some Reformed. I love Reformed preachers. I really love them. I know you do too. They're fire. They really get into the Scripture. They don't compromise, and I really like that about them. However, they're saying things like, well, there are no gay Christians. Now, homosexuality is absolutely, positively a sin, and so you could say, aha. There's a person who says I'm a Christian, but they're gay and they have a partner. Okay, so that's not allowed. Well, what about a lesbian? No, that's also not allowed. Well, what about an adulterer? Well, what about someone who is angry a lot? Yeah. And so, you get down and you think, well, I think most of the church would disqualify themselves with these sins after accepting Christ. I mean, we all struggle, and Paul talks about that. Well, right in here, he talks about, my spirit wants to do one thing, and my body keeps dragging.
Chapter 7, yes.
Yeah. So I think that's an important distinction to make. How encompassing. I think salvation is massively encompassing, but I do think that within church discipline and that kind of thing, it's a smaller thing. For example, I don't think you can have some really open sin in the church. I mean, if you think about our church and you're looking out there and you see some people that are, really flouting things, I think that's the moment you say, look, we're not saying you're not saved, but you are misbehaving in a big way,
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, indeed.
It's tricky.
Yeah. So that's the argument until chapter 8. So I think the first bit section ends in chapter 8, and it does really end as it's really the climax of of the book. And again, he's showing just how wonderful the gospel is, that it brings righteousness by faith alone, and this gospel of grace. And talk about how, in all these things, you're more than contrast, and that wonderful passage at the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9 begins a new section of the book. Of course, it's still the same argument. I think how I see this is, so if chapter 1 to 118 to chapter 8 is talked about, it's defending the gospel in general, as it were. So this is where the gospel is a wonderful thing, and Jews and Gentiles need it.
Yeah, this is the area of Gentile pronouns.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So it counts with the and there's somebody keeps referring to, as it were. Yeah. So even especially from chapter 6 onwards, it keeps saying but what if you say this? And they say God forbid, something like that. Yes, until chapter 8. Then chapter 9, I think, forward. Then it gets into the meat of what he really wants to say, which is basically why the good news, why preaching the good news or the gospel to the Gentiles is also good for the Jews. So that Jewish objector that he had in mind, he said, actually, I know you are struggling by the fact that I'm preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, but actually preaching the gospel to the Gentiles is also good for you. I think that's what he's basically saying from chapter 9.
Well, he gives a lot of purely Jewish stuff here in chapter 9. I mean, he goes back into Jeremiah talking about the potter and the clay, and he goes back to Pharaoh and the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, not sending him to hell, but not damning him to hell, but hardening, and that God has the right to alter the plan to get his ultimate goal.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, so God is sovereign, isn't it? Yeah, God is sovereign.
And this is an alteration, because I think these Jews, they're expecting Messiah comes and then they're on top, and he's the king and everything's good, and they're the ones being a light unto the nations, and they're the a kingdom of priests and all this kind of stuff, and they're looking for maybe some new clothes and some really some status. And all of a sudden, the people that they're supposed to be above are like mingling with them, and there's got to be some, doesn't that violate our covenant, and so I think he has to answer those questions.
Yeah, chapter 9 to 11 is a very controversial, very controversial passage. How I see it, I think it revolves around 3 prayers. In this section. So at the beginning of chapter 9 is the prayer that he doesn't pray. And he, verse 3, could wish that I myself were cast and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, those of my own race, the people of Israel. Theirs is the adoption of sons. There's the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship, the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is the human ancestry of Christ, who is God over all, forever praised. Amen. So again, this I is defending himself, of course, from the accusation that he's sort of a traitor. And he said, I'm not a traitor. I wish I could go to hell. I wish I could be accursed, cut off from Christ, for the sake of my brothers, the Jews. And then it, of course, talks about all the privileges of his Jewish brothers. So that the prayer he can't pray. And the reason why he can't pray it is, of course, because God is sovereign over what is going on, So it can't fight God. That's what, again, he goes on to talk about. The word of God has not failed, as they think. So that's the prayer he doesn't pray. At the beginning of the chapter 10 is the prayer that he does pray. And that is, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. So that's the prayer he does pray. He's praying that they may be saved. And of course, he talks about, and the rest of that chapter, how right from the beginning, the plan of God has been for the salvation of the Gentiles.
Yeah.
You know, even in the Old Testament, it was always the plan of God that the Gentiles would come to faith through the proclamation of the gospel. And then lastly, the prayer, the other prayer that he does pray at the end of chapter 11, which is the doxology of the prayer. And from verse 33, and it's basically a glory to God, glorifying God. But I think, so if you ask Paul, how is you preaching to the Gentiles good for the Jews? And I think that answer would be in chapter 11, verse 13. Chapter 11, verse 13. It says, I am talking to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I make much of my ministry in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. And he's saying, as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, and I want to do that. I want to make much of that preaching to the Gentiles in the hope that some of them might be saved.
Yes.
So he's preaching his ministry to the Gentiles is good for the Jews, because as he does that, hopefully the Israelites will be provoked to jealousy, and that might bring them in, might invite them to come in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, then from verse in chapter 12 and 13, which is the ethical commands, as they are called, of Romans, when it now begins to give very practical instructions. And I think how they fit in with the rest of the letter is that this is the kind of the church that will provoke Israel to jealousy. As they live these ethical principles, which of course are what Jews are meant to live out, but they are not living out. As the Gentiles, as the church lives out these ethical principles, the Jews will see something and look at them and say, that's how God wanted us to live. That's what is written in the law. And we are not doing that. Yeah. And hopefully they will be provoked to jealousy. So there's a lot of ethical commands here.
We need to do better.
Yeah, we need to do better. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question here. At the time of the writing of Romans, whenever it was, let's just say 58, whatever. If there had been a critical mass of Jews who accepted Christ, even then, would this have triggered the kingdom on earth? Would this have triggered the second coming right then? Or is that just no or not?
Yeah, it's difficult to know, and I think Paul doesn't answer it. What Paul does say, though, is that whatever has happened has been good. So he says God is good in redeeming things. So the fact that Israel has rejected God in mercy, God has redeemed that for the sake of the Gentiles. So by the Jews rejecting the gospel has gone to the Gentiles. So God redeems even terrible things. And therefore he says, how wonderful it would have been. Actually, I think he probably answered, because then he says, how wonderful if their rejection means salvation for the Gentiles. How about the acceptance? It would be much better glory. Exactly. Indeed. Yeah.
I mean, they are rejecting their own king, their own Messiah.
Yeah, indeed.
And I think the Gospels seem to me to be the story of all the Old Testament coming true, and then Acts is almost, and the rejection of Christ, and then Acts is almost, to me, saying, and they reject him again and again, and okay, that's it. It's you've lost right now, and this kingdom is going to go into abeyance, but he will come back.
Yeah, I think there's hope. I think Paul holds out hope for Israel.
Daniel's prophetic clock will start ticking again.
Yeah, I think definitely. I think Paul definitely thinks that there will be sort of a revival. Yeah, among the Jews.
There has to be in order to make it all happen.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. So that's chapter 12 from 13. Lots of ethical commands there, moral teaching there. This is the church you need to be, and this is the kind of church that will provoke Israel to jealousy. And I think the key word I think is worship. So this, worship 24/7, worship as a lifestyle, life lived, in the face of God. Verse 14 and 15, I think, presupposes that will succeed. So if they live out this life, this ethical life, that the non-believers, the Jews can look at and be provoked to jealousy, hopefully they will come. And when they come, what happens? How do we deal with them? How do we handle them? And Paul says, accept them, welcome them. Welcome them generously. And I think that's the point of the weak and strong thing. And it's the weak are, of course, the Jews that are coming back as they're provoked to jealousy and they're coming to the church. But of course, this is now a church led by Gentiles, that's majority Gentiles. This is a church that eats pork, for example, and does all those things. And Paul is saying, yes, as they come, there will be people that will be struggling, for example, with eating pork. And he says, don't serve pork at your men evening,
The church barbecue is a real opportunity for all kinds of missions.
Don't take it in their face. So that's basically what's So I think that's what the weak and strong thing is there. So the strong are these Gentile Christians and also the Jewish Christians, of course, that have been liberated, that were freed from the law in this church. But as the new Jews come in, they will be struggling with, these guys are not being circumcised. These guys are eating pork. And Paul is saying, as much as possible, do not put a stumbling block on them. Because, and if they come and insist that they don't want to continue eating pork, says, do not judge them, do not try and educate them, and tell them,
That was something that in the last sermon I heard on this from our priest. He mentioned that don't be a stumbling block. And I thought to myself, but that's what Jesus was. I mean, when do you need a stumbling block? When do you need something to gain your attention like a stumbling block? I mean, if you've ever stumbled over, a rock or a heavy object, you know that it's a jar to the body, and you might even fall down, So it's so I understand in one way. Don't be a stumbling block to other people, Don't do something that they say, "Ooh, I don't want." But here it's. You can almost see, especially churches in the United States, where they want to be seeker sensitive, and so, and in the UK as well, they want to open their church to rave parties and this kind of stuff, so that they're not a stumbling block. I can imagine them using that. So where do we need a stumbling block? And maybe Jesus, God should be the stumbling block. But if we're putting stumbling blocks, that's probably the wrong thing.
I think that's right. We want the gospel to be the stumbling block.
And not
other stuff. So clear all this other stuff. Let the gospel itself be the stumbling block. Yeah, in a sense. I think that's a good way to say it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So basically that's what he says. He says, welcome them. Is it what? I mean, I think especially chapter 15, basically saying, coming to faith, being a believer is such a wonderful thing, It's a shame if somebody do not become a Christian because you think you want to retain your right, my right to eat pork, for example. So there's nothing wrong in eating pork or drinking alcohol. But if it's going to cause a stumbling block to somebody else, then it's probably good that you lay aside your rights, and your freedoms, your Christian freedoms, for the sake of a brother. And I think it used the example of Christ. So chapter 15, verse 3, for even Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the insults of those who insult you have fallen on me. He didn't please himself. He didn't just, think about his rights, and his privileges. He laid his rights down. He laid his privileges down for the sake of other people. And he's telling these Christians, yes, you have rights, you have freedoms, the things called Christian freedoms. But there are certain times for the gospel that we should lay down those freedoms and those rights for the sake of the new Christian, for the sake of somebody else who is struggling.
What would be a good example of that? I mean, I can think, here comes, let's just take a really obvious one. Here comes a gay couple into the church. And you think, they're looking, they're looking for something. And you think, I mean, of course, a gay couple comes into the church. You don't immediately say, oh, no, I mean, you don't say that immediately. But how would you do that? A gay couple comes into the church, and of course we want to accept them with open arms. And if they accept Christ, if they Ephesians 2:8-9, and maybe 8, 9, and 10, because they start to do good works and that kind of thing, but they're still engaging in a sinful lifestyle. Where stumbling block. I can imagine that one person would say, well, at that point, you just say, we invite you to leave the church until you sort this out. And many gay couples have done this. One has found the Lord, said, my marriage is an affront to God, and I'm going to end it here, and that happens. But someone else may say, hey, don't be a stumbling block. Don't hurt your brothers, because they would be your brothers. Don't hurt your brother's faith by saying, well, what you do is a real sin. I mean, it's a niggly, difficult.
It is.
thing.
It's a difficult thing, and I think it's just first needs to be clear. And I think Grant was really helpful with this yesterday, that this is about Christian convictions, or religious convictions. I think that's what is going on here. The Jew is struggling. He's struggling because he has his Old Testament and he's reading it, and he's interpreting in a certain way, So it's not like he's coming up with something. No, this is something so in that way. So these are rather convictions rather than, so it's not sin. So again, you can't use this to say, you can just do whatever.
So, I mean, you don't see sort of the 10 Commandments in here, Those people who decide that God is second in their life, don't be a stumbling block to them. Wait a minute, no, that's not it. That's a good distinction here, that these are cultural, and these are convictions, and these are processes and ways of doing things, and don't let those get in the way. Now, if you have somebody coming into your church who, I don't know, makes pornographic movies, or this would be, there are all kinds of so these people should be able to come in and find Christ. What Romans here is saying is more of sort of Jewish traditions. Don't let that mess things up.
Yeah, indeed. I think in my culture, for example, alcohol would be a big thing. So I think there's a Christian freedom to enjoy alcohol, but for all sorts of reasons.
Well, that's what Mike Winger said. Mike Winger did a whole series on it, so it must be okay.
Yeah, so things like that. But even with the gay thing, I think you could create obstacles by how you address the topic or how you handle them, So I think there's so like we say, we want the gospel, we want the truth to be the stumbling block, not us.
Yes.
So that means as we present the truth, as we present the gospel, we want to present that in a way that it is the gospel and the truth that's going to confront them and not me.
This Bible, this gospel should be the stumbling block and not you. And your dumb ideas.
Yeah. And that's why I'm very passionate to believe in expository preaching.
Yeah.
Because expository preaching, you're helping people to see this is not me saying, this is the text saying it, and trying to apply that rather than these are just my ideas, these are just, this is the text.
Yeah.
And as you help to open the text to people and they see, actually, this is what it is, then that might just help to, yeah. So that's it. So, of course, and then he ends with the purpose of the letter, which comes at the end, and then he talks about, how his plans, and basically that he's finished his work. Chapter 15, verse 19. He's been, so from Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum, I have fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ. It has always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundation. That has been his goal. He doesn't want to preach where somebody else has preached. And the whole Eastern Mediterranean, at least according to him, has been reached with the gospel. And now he wants to go to new ground where the gospel has not been preached. And that is in Spain. And so he's inviting them, of course, telling them, I want you, I hope to visit you soon, verse 24, while passing through and afterwards, and have you assist me on my journey there after I've enjoyed your company for a while. So he's heading to Spain. That's the next part of his ministry. And he's recruiting the Romans to come alongside him and support him financially and by encouragement to go there. And then, of course, he sends greetings.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And but 16, you said, and he sends these greetings, but there's a lot in 16.
Indeed. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And there's a lot of, I don't know, opportunity to misuse things. For example, 16:3, greet Priscilla and Aquila. It says, I think in the King James, maybe it says that in the NIV. If you get the literal one, it says, greet Priscilla and Aquilus. So Aquilus sounds male, but Priscilla doesn't sound male. My fellow workmen in Christ Jesus. Okay. So, when we talk about complementarian or egalitarian, this is some place that people go to, even though it's maybe some sort of throwaway comments here at the end. From Paul's point of view, there's still theology in there that people.
Yeah, I think, it's a terrible argument. Yeah.
No. I'm not saying. I'm just saying.
Yeah. People come to yes.
There's a lot.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Even just in these names, and then the titles that he gives them of fellow workmen,
fellow workers. Yeah. Indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay.
Wonderful book. Yeah.
That is really nice, and I'm glad we could go over it like that, coming from just sort of slightly different angles to this book, but foundational in our understanding of salvation and what the gospel is and how all of this goes and what our obligations are as Christians. Yeah. I think we've gone long enough. Are we trying people's patience with this?
It's probably an hour.
Nice. I really like to hear what you say. It's really, really good. And it kind of also gives, I think, for me, and I think for other people, it gives an insight into, how does Daniel make these sermons of his? How does he thinking? And I think what you show here is that, you're focusing on Romans, and then, you reach over into Galatians, and then you reach over into Corinthians, and you're, putting that together. And I think that sort of more of a 3D understanding of the books of the Bible is such a nice thing to see. So
it's my weakness. So I don't have the problem of missing the forest for the trees. So I think we are different in that. Yeah. So for me, I think my temptation is to miss the trees for the forest. So I'm very big on the overall idea, the flow of the argument, things like that. Yeah. I think you are better in the trees. What's going on here? What's going on with this word?
What idiot what's going on? Every pronoun.
Yes, this pronoun. What's this pronoun doing?
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for that, and I really like this. I think we would have done this anyway, even if we didn't have a camera, but we do have a camera. So We'll cut it off here. And we will say to everyone, thank you for watching and God bless.
Ciao.